thank you so much for the opportunity to come and talk to you a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing at Space Doctors, a small company focused on understanding culture and communications within culture. That's what we do. We spend our lives looking at culture and how we tell stories and how we build communications for all sorts of different people around the world. And we've been working a little bit on some of the storytelling that we see as part of the whole discussion that we have on climate at the moment. And I want to just share some of that with you, see what you think. Don't have all the answers. Let's have a conversation. But I want to just share some of the points of view that we think are sort of quite interesting. So, shall we start with the story? Let's start with the story. Once upon a time, there was an orca called Tilikum. Does anybody know of Tilikum, the orca? Has anybody heard of Tilikum? So Tilikum was captured when he was 3 years old in the Sounds of Seattle. And he was transported to SeaWorld at 3 years old. And he was kept in quite a small pool, and he was taught tricks and taught to perform to an audience. And this is his picture, his trainer, who's called Dawn Brancho, and she taught him the tricks. She was one of 3 trainers that Tilikum killed while he was in captivity. And it's said that he killed her and the other 2 because he was paranoid, because he had been taken out of his social context and put into this very closed-in space that wasn't where he needed to be. And this story was dramatized in a movie called Blackfish. Have a watch. It's a really good story, even albeit a true story. You know, we were kind of responsible for what happened there, and he was sort of fighting back. And what made the story so compelling is that during the movie, you get to know not only Tilikum, but you also get to know Dawn Brancho, and you get to know the other 2 trainers, because there's plenty of footage of them and the way in which they'd built relationship with him. It was easy to imagine in the film that there could be a time when orcas weren't in captivity, that we could see a time where that didn't happen anymore. And actually what happened was, when the film was released, celebrities started to boycott SeaWorld. And then people like you and me decided that was probably a good thing to do as well. And we stopped going to SeaWorld to see orcas in captivity. And shortly after that, SeaWorld announced the ending of their program to have orcas in captivity, which was a great thing. So it was a super powerful story, told really well, which motivated people to behave differently. It had a really positive effect. And it's an example of how we all know that powerful stories can really bring about meaningful change. Stories are the richest carriers of ideas in our world. They are carriers of meaning. They help us understand the world around us. They help us frame what we see. And they're our only way to tell the future, is we create it through our stories. They're also a really compelling call to action sometimes, as in the Tilikum and orca story. And once in a while, there is a real story that drives us to change. Humans have been called the storytelling ape. You know, it's kind of fundamental since the beginning of time that we've seen these stories that help us make sense of the world around us. And we use stories in our work at Space Doctors. We create stories for all sorts of organizations. And I just wanted to share a couple with you so you kind of know what we mean by story sometimes. So this was a piece of work that we did for a corporation called Mattel. And Mattel make a doll called Barbie, who I suspect you've all heard of. And by exploring some of the social and cultural kind of issues around representations of girls and their potential in the world and how those things are framed, we could identify for Barbie some new powerful stories of how they could tell a story of limitless potential for girls. And when we got to that point and we got to that understanding, we said, okay, let's create a story. And we created this story, which was Close the Dream Gap, which was part of their advertising communication from there on in, and also drove the creation of a whole new series of dolls who represented, you know, women doing what women really do. You know, the scientists, the teachers, the people who are functioning way beyond just wearing short skirts and having long legs. So this was an important story of positive change. By understanding culture and saying what is the issue here, and then framing the idea, framing the story, we can then help that brand, that product, be something different and encourage some positive change in the world. It's a more culturally relevant idea, actually. And just one more example of the kind of work that we do is we work a lot for Microsoft, who work around the world. This was a project for the base in Seattle. And the question here was, how do we go about telling a story of social good for Microsoft, of all the things they do, and they do some really good stuff for people. What's the story that we can tell? And this was the story that we came up with, and it was about engaging Microsoft with computer science, which is fine. That's a rational story. But actually what we did was we said, let's connect with the teachers in junior schools and not so great junior schools in North America. And let's teach those teachers coding. And let's teach those teachers how to teach their students coding. Because then the teachers learn and the students learn, and suddenly both can be moving forward, developing a skill that's so much needed but wasn't taught at the school at the time. So we taught the teachers and the teachers taught the children. So that was a piece of work which was all about trailblazing a path for computer science for Microsoft. It's another story. It's something that we just decided we wanted to create, and it motivated some really positive behavior. So as we've learned from Microsoft, and working with them is quite a challenge when you're in the world of story, because they're technologists, they are interested in science, they're interested in facts, they're interested in efficacy and performance. We learnt very quickly from them, and it's very clear, that facts kind of need to be brought to life in order for their potential to be felt or for their potential to be imagined. We need storytellers. We need people who say, empirically, we know how many kilos of plastic or megatons of plastic there are in the sea. But until a consummate storyteller like David Attenborough picks up a piece on the beach and says, guys, plastic, this is what it's doing to us, and tells that story in that emotional way, when that happens, we motivate change. People's behavior starts to move. So facts need to be brought to life in order to be compelling. David Attenborough is definitely a storyteller before he is a scientist. So stories help us make sense of the world. They help us shape our worldview. They help us feel viscerally what's going on. They compel us to action in the way that facts and science doesn't. They're the only way we understand the future. So we were interested in what are the stories that we're being told now about climate change? What are we being exposed to in the UK today, every day? And what's shaping our view of the world? Because our view of the world isn't just our view of the world. It's constantly shaped by what we read and what we experience and the conversations that we have. And we found amongst many stories being told that there is a growing propensity, an increasing presence of this story of an uninhabitable Earth. That's kind of what we would call the dominant story that we see in climate crisis at the moment. It's the thing that fills us clearly with dread and with doom. But it is absolutely square on the dominant story that we hear in the world of climate change. More than 80% of media articles in the UK today around climate change still use these kind of disaster framings. So we're getting this from many angles, loud and clear at the moment. Thankfully, though, it's still a story. It's still in the future. It hasn't happened yet. I'm not saying that there aren't terrible times ahead and really difficult things to deal with. But this is still just a story we're telling ourselves. And I think it's beholden upon us to ask ourselves, is this the right story to tell now, given what we know about where we are? Is this the right story to continue to propagate? Or maybe even who is it that's benefiting from the propagation of this story across 80% of our media outlets at the moment? So we need to counter these stories, because the difficulty is the way stories work is if we don't counter them with another story, replace them with another story, then they gather momentum. And as they gather momentum, they gather power. And then we start to feel them and we start to believe them. And they start to materialize and become true. So we need to counter these stories of doom. And it's not just this sort of story that we see. We see it in other places as well. Now, Extinction Rebellion have done extraordinary things in the last year plus. But when we're talking about some of these stories of doom, we also talk about helplessness. We talk about them putting us in a position of not feeling we can do anything about it. It's too big for us to do anything about. And that's not very helpful. This is the Extinction Rebellion Red Brigade. It's not part of a sort of typical street protest. It doesn't look like a typical street protest. It doesn't have the kind of the clamour of activism about it. What we see when the Red Brigade get together is a kind of highly ritualised, silent and very mournful event. And that in itself is a sort of a coming together somehow in the face of extinction, somehow in the face of death. It's definitely a mourning. These people are not looking happy about the future, right? And there are other stories that we hear. This is the letter to the future. Did you see this? This is the first glacier in Iceland that disappeared completely. And the Icelandic folks wrote a letter to the future. And they said, this monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and what needs to be done. Only you will know if we did it. So they're kind of acknowledging that we do know what's happening. And we do feel the need to do something about it. But probably we won't know whether we did the right things. So this has a little bit more hope in it, but it's still centred in mourning and it's still centred in loss. Quite chirpy so far, huh? Bet you're glad you came. Let's be a bit chirpy, shall we? Oh, Greta! So here is the wonderful Greta Thunberg. It's interesting, isn't it? I think Greta Thunberg has been amazingly compelling for a lot of people because she's a bit like an Inspector Calls. She's kind of arrived from the future. She's sort of landed here. She's a child with great wisdom and great directness and great communication capabilities. So she's had a huge and I think very positive impact. The thing I want you to consider, though, is that when she gets quoted in this way, change is coming, whether you like it or not, does that feel like a call to action? Or does that feel like, oh, right, okay, I'll go home and shut the door then? What does that feel like to you? Change is coming, whether you like it or not. If it wasn't Greta there, if it was a sort of my age, 52-year-old school teacher pointing their finger at you, it would feel very disempowering as a thought. Change is coming whether you like it or not. And it's interesting because if you think about the social movements that have really made an impact, and heavens, we need a social movement now. If you think about the ones that have really made an impact over time, the suffragettes, they were very clear about what they wanted. They were very clear that we wanted to include women in the political structures and the voting structures of this country. Martin Luther King said, I have a dream. He didn't say, I have a crisis, change is coming whether you like it or not. He said, I have a dream and this is it. This is what I want. The slavery movement knew exactly, the anti-slavery movement knew exactly what they wanted. The social movements that are successful, that generate change, are very clear about where they're headed, about where the destination is. And they don't say, change is coming whether you like it or not. The other thing that Greta does is she appeals to science. She says, unite behind the science. She puts it on the sail of her ship and on the side of her boat, and she sails across the Atlantic. And she says, unite behind the science. I don't think that's very compelling as a message. I don't think today science and its abstraction and it's just pure fact about it, I'm not sure that is enough. We need emotion. We need to connect with an emotional impact of that in order to really get it and to really see what it means. So I think much as she is wonderful for lots of reasons, she's not helping us paint a picture of where are we headed then, Greta? What do we do? Where do we go? We're not hearing that from her. Not that that's her job, of course, but we're not hearing that from her just at the moment. And even The Guardian, bless The Guardian, is telling us that it's changed its language. It's telling us that we now have climate crisis and climate emergency, and they will no longer use the phrase climate change. And they've stopped using global warming, and they've started using global heating. They've turned the temperature up a little bit. And they've stopped using the idea of saving the planet and actually talk now about facing extinction. So again, this discourse is changing. We see how culture changes through the language sometimes. We plot the way language moves and shifts. And what we're seeing here is not a language of the future, not a language of a positive vision of where we could head to. What we see is a hunkering down into the doom and the difficulty that we undoubtedly face, but that's what we're deciding to focus on. So, the question we're asking is, do the stories that we're hearing today set us up? Do they encourage us? Do they help us change faster than ever before? Do they help us feel and act and relate to each other differently? Do they call us forward? Do they call us through this to a new way of living? And you will perhaps be unsurprised to know that we don't think so. We think there are some musts for us now as we stand square in the face of what's coming our way. There are some things that we need to do. And thing one is not to progress with the existing story. The thing one is to retell, is to reframe, and is to reimagine what we see as the future. Let's have a look at how that works. But first of all, a quote from Mr. Harari, Sapiens author. I don't know if you've read Sapiens, but the Sapiens author, who said, he talks about imagining, this imagining of a future. He said, any large-scale human cooperation is rooted in common myths that only exists in people's collective imagination. So where is our collective imagination about the future? What can we see? What can we envisage beyond doom at the moment? What can we see that's calling us forward? And we can start imagining some sort of preferable futures. So, the story of being brave enough to imagine a preferable future is in this piece of work. I don't know if you've seen this. This is called A Message from the Future with AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. It's a small work, but it just starts to talk to you about the kind of things you can do, and it paints beautiful pictures and animations and ideas about what the future could start to look like if we just do these small things. It's not talking about these small things as elements of decarbonisation or how do we reduce this or how do we stop doing that. It's saying, look, here's the positive thoughts. Here's the ways in which we can start to create a more positive future. It returns hope to the climate discussion. It's not in denial, but it's returning hope to the discussion, and it empowers people to take action to gain that reward of a sort of prosperous future. So then we thought to ourselves, what's getting in the way? Why aren't we talking about this? Why aren't we easily constructing what the future should be and moving happily towards it? Because that's typically what we do. So what's happened? Why are we sort of stuck in this stasis? And we sort of appealed to a model that we really love, which I'm going to share with you, by a guy called Per Stoknes, and I'll show you what the model is now. It identifies kind of 5 core reasons why we think we might be stuck, why it's difficult to see beyond where we are today. And the first is distance. The first is that the discussion of climate change and climate crisis is it's all happening somewhere else. Now, that's slightly changing now as we start to see, I think it's referred to as biblical floods in the north of England. That's starting to change, but for a while it was simply the Arctic or the Antarctic. It was all happening somewhere else, and it was happening somewhere else in time as well. So it's happening in 2100 or somewhere out there. Distance, too far away, not for me to bother about. Doom, it's too big, too scary. It's too much of a looming disaster. It implies too much sacrifice. It makes us fearful, and we suffer fatigue when we get fearful, so we can't think about that. Or dissonance. I fly and I drive, but that's kind of causing the issue, and I'm not sure how I can do that and deal with that, and it's very difficult to find the resolutions and find the easy ways through. Dissonance stops us moving on and actually pushes us towards alibis. I fly 3 times a year, but I recycle, so it's fine. So we have these crazy alibis. Denial. Head in the sand. If I just keep really quiet about this, it might just go away. I'm not going to connect with it because I don't know how to. I'm just going to live and act as if I don't know. And then identity. Some of us for a long time have thought, this is the bold and brilliant future I imagine for my children. These are all the places I'm going to travel to in my retirement. I haven't done them yet because I've been saving them for my retirement. And all of a sudden we're looking at that future and thinking it's not really going to be perhaps quite what I imagined at some point. And that compromises my sense of identity, of who I am, of who I believe I am. That gets compromised by that. So identity gets a bit shaken by this too. So there's some pretty good reasons there. There's 5 pretty good reasons for why we're just not spending too much time focusing positively on what the brighter future could be. Fortunately, there are some responses to some of these things, some ways in which we can build stories, imagine new ideas, which can take us beyond these things. Social. So move distance to social. So frame what we're doing, our discussions around climate change, our discussions around sustainability, frame them in the near and the personal and the urgent. Don't let them be far away and somewhere down the line and one day when. They've got to be near, they've got to be personal, and they've got to be urgent. Rooftop panels are so brilliant because if you see a rooftop panel on a street, you're telling the world, this is me here right now, what I'm doing in this space, and other people down the street will want to get theirs too, and they communicate in that very local, social, personal kind of way. Move from doom to support. So, tell the story of the zero carbon economy and beyond. Talk about cleaner air, the fact that our children can walk home from school without getting their lungs polluted, the fact that we could potentially have a different work-life balance in that context, the fact that we're not having to go through so much consumption which is just radically compensatory for a kind of a terrible lack of lifestyle and working too hard. There are positive pictures of the future of the zero carbon economy which can be so much more supportive than the ones of doom that we see at the moment. There's a great cartoon, which is strangely in this setting, which you may have seen, where somebody's talking about climate change, and on the wall behind her, she has a whole list of all the positive benefits of climate change. Here are all the wonderful things that are going to happen. And somebody in the audience stands up and says, but what if it's a hoax and we've created a better world for nothing? So I just think telling that positive story. Moving from dissonance into simple actions, make it really easy. Communicate new, specific climate positive actions that people can just get on top of and start to propagate. Signal it. Don't deny it. Signal what's happening. Communicate what's happening and feed back all the positive changes. This week there have been 2 pieces of news. One piece of news about a tiger population turning round and starting to increase for the first time in ages. And one piece of news about the functional extinction of the koala bear in Australia. This is the one we remember. This is the one we've really heard of. I'm not sure we're hearing about species that actually have remarkably recovered in the last little while. And then tell stories. You know, we really love, our brains love stories of where we want to go. So move from distance and doom and dissonance and denial and identity, and move into the social, the supportive, the simple, the signalling of positive change and the stories that we're looking to tell. So we find this understanding really helpful in the nature of the shift that we want to make. And actually you can boil it down into a move from the abstract, the technical, the remote, the global and the distant into the real, the practical, the local, the personal and the social. Because that's where you connect with individuals, that's where you connect with their emotions and their souls and the things that are going to drive them to behave differently. And I think that discourse, Greta's discourse of unite behind the science, kind of sits on the left-hand side a little bit. It is in that kind of behind the science, okay, what science, what numbers, do we believe numbers today anyway? Do we know what the facts really are? That's difficult. And I kind of think sometimes some of the economic models we work with too seem to sit on that side. They feel abstracted. They feel overly technical. And we need to find the better story to talk to them through. And we know that. It's funny working with Microsoft and Samsung and P&G and some of the other people we work with. There's some great technologists in those businesses. But if you want to talk to them about sustainability, you can't talk to them in their role. You have to talk to them as an individual, as a parent, as a father, as a cousin, as a husband, or as a wife. Because that's where you connect with the real and the personal. And then you can take them back through into their job role and say, let's bring some of those values back into what we're doing on a daily basis. The story and the real and the practical is what makes a difference. So that's one model to think about when you're thinking about what are the stories that I need to tell to my family, to my organization, to the NGO I work with, to the people at work. What are the stories that I want to tell about the things that we're doing? That's one structure to think about it. There's another structure which is thinking about the nature of the story the nature itself, not just the transition you want to make, but actually the nature of the story that you want to tell. And we've been trying to map some of those cultural ideas, some of those stories for a little while, so that we can provide for our clients a framework to think about the story they want to tell. And we can start to sort of move them in the right sorts of directions. And it's a work in progress that I want to share with you. So here we go. So one sort of story that you can tell is a story in this world of human resourcefulness, of human relationships, and how that needs to change. We talk about, in the realm of sustainability, or the realm of climate change, we talk about a sort of a radical decentering of the human. We talk about that quite a lot. What we kind of mean by it is humans are center stage, right at the front in a lot of the discourse in the world at the moment. In order to move things on, we need to move off center stage. We need to bring the animals, the plants, the rest of the world. We need to understand ourselves in relation to that differently. We need to reconfigure human, non-human relationships. That's simple as the rise in veganism. That's a reconfiguring of a human, non-human relationship. The other thing that sits in this place is stories of empathy. And in particular, stories of empathy with those people who have already been affected by climate change, who are already on the receiving end, who are on the periphery. There's quite a lot of thinking that suggests that most of the innovation comes from the periphery. And thinking about that, and this is a really interesting story that was told recently about a group of European young people, young activists who went to COP25 in Chile, which got cancelled, I believe. And they ended up moving up to the Amazon and staging a new meeting. And the replacement meeting, the alternative meeting, was to meet with some of the indigenous communities in the Amazon to hear from them their story, to hear from them what their current experience is, and to bring that story back and tell that story here. And maybe some of what we need to do is to sort of extend that level of empathy to make sure that to not fall into the trap of believing we have all the answers, because we created quite a lot of the problem. So maybe we don't have a lot of the answers. Maybe we need to look elsewhere for some of those answers. And I think younger people and the level of just kind of raw empathy in that much younger generation is much higher than I ever saw in my generation, at least. So I think this is a really interesting beginnings of who tells the story of the future. And maybe it's not us. And the other sort of story you can tell, apart from human resourcefulness, is perhaps a story of radical reinvention. So the technologists, the pioneering folks, the visionary leaders who stand up and drive significant change. Do you know this chap here? He's called Boyan Slat. He's from Holland. He was 14 and he decided that he was just going to go out there and clear up the Pacific garbage patch, which is quite a big thing, right? It's quite a big thing. And he's been working really hard on that ever since and leading his company and creating this amazing ocean cleanup machine to get out there and just deal with the Pacific garbage patch. Doing something on a huge scale, something that we do in a beach clean on a Saturday in Brighton where I live. But doing it on a mega scale. This guy's a visionary. He's a technological leader. He's extraordinary in what he's attempting to do, even in just its intent, right? That's a story of technological leadership that we need as we move forward. And even Mr. Musk, Mr. Window Smasher, as we call him. I mean, we can all laugh at him now, right? Because he's had a few sort of fairly dodgy moments recently. But, you know, arguably, because of his leadership, because of his commitment to a particular way of being, what he's done over the years has massively accelerated the development and the uptake of electric vehicles. You know, he's had an extraordinary impact over the years. And his solar roof tiles and all his in-home batteries and all of that stuff, at least it kind of makes us feel like there's some sense of possibility. There's some sense of a way through. And he's an example of what can be possible, you know, even though he doesn't kind of quite have the standing that he used to, Mr. Musk. So 2 stories. So we're thinking about different types of stories. 2 stories. The first one is about human resourcefulness. It's about love. It's about empathy. It's about imagining that perhaps we don't have all the answers. It's about imagining that maybe some of this is just about getting out of the way of nature and letting it be. The hero in these stories is about community. It's about belonging. And they're quite bottom-up stories. You know, they're kind of grassroots stories coming through, and they're quite evolutionary. But that's one sort of place where you can seed a story. Oops. And the other place that we talked about, on the other hand, is a kind of a radical reinvention story. It's the technological visionary. It's the charismatic individual. It's a story of power and a story of mastery. The hero is the kind of genius, and it's the influence that person has. It's a top-down story. That person has a vision, and he's asking you to follow him or her. It's kind of quite a revolutionary thing. So those are 2 stories that sort of exist in different spaces and work in different ways. But both of them are accessible to us in telling the story of the future. They're weapons in our armory, I suppose. They're sometimes opposing, but they are stories that we can tell to go forward. And sort of what we find is quite interesting is you can then kind of map those, right? It doesn't take very much from that point to say, look, human relationship sits up in this space here. It's all about telling stories that transform relationships with the world and all of its inhabitants. And then individualist visionaries and technological visionaries sit down here. And those are stories of individuals whose qualities, their charisma, their humility, Jacinta Ardern, I think, is in this place here. You know, they kind of fill us with inspiration. Those are 2 levels of stories. And of course, it's then easy to imagine that there might be another 2 stories in the map. This one, which is about, we call it progress through reason. So this is telling stories in which we evolve the structures that we know and that we trust. So a great example in here would be Unilever. A great example would be Unilever moving from where it was when I worked there many years ago to where it is today, which is an organization that has transformed significantly to drive positive change in the world. And then the final story would be one of a radical reframing. The final story would be, how do we tell stories of collective ingenuity and defiance? How do we tell stories about changing the game probably in the face of sort of overwhelming odds. That's a different sort of story. That's where the Extinction Rebellion story sits today. But many other stories sit in there too. Anything that reframes stuff sits in there. So 4 stories, or different types of stories. Let's have a little look at them in detail, because I think they're all valid and all starting to emerge as the beginnings of our possibilities of the future. Things that we can hold on to, that we can fuel, that we can get behind to create a more positive vision of where we're headed. Human resourcefulness, it's all about the story that we tell about local democracy and community. It's about collectives. It's about coming together and delivering a new way, a more communal way of delivering a particular service or a particular product. It's a return to the commons. It's what Georges Monbiot will talk about in reinstating the commons in our life. And it's about belonging. It feels like we're doing some work with a chap at the moment who writes a lot about unbelonging. He writes a lot about us being in a state of unbelonging. And by which he means we used to belong somewhere. We have a sense of what that used to be like, but we don't feel that now. So there's a loss of belonging along the way. And you can wrap that sense of unbelonging into the Brexit discussion. You can wrap it into the climate change discussion. You can wrap it into a lot of the sort of key issues that we have around us in the UK at the moment. But that sense of how do we reinstate a true sense of belonging for people? And it's all the discussions of natural rhythms and of Gaia and loss of the mother and all of those things that we talk about. They're stories of love and empathy. Now, every story has a shadow side. So every story has a dark side. And the dark side of the human resourcefulness and relationship story is that it's performative, that it doesn't really achieve anything. It's just people having a go at stuff, and they don't really deliver anything significant. It's not efficient enough, and it's not powerful enough. That's the dark side of it, which we need to acknowledge. These aren't Pollyanna stories. They only exist because there's a dark side. They only exist because there's a challenge. So here's a really good example, the Thingery. Have you heard about the Thingery? The Thingery's great. You probably have similar ones, I would imagine, around Devon. The Thingery is a communal resource library. It's operated as a piece of commons. It's operated in the community. There's a whole bunch of them in Vancouver. It's a local equipment lending library. People collect their tools, they put them in one place. Somebody brings a lawnmower, somebody brings a hedge trimmer, somebody brings a paint stripper. It sits in there, you borrow them. That's it. At one level, it's very simple. But it is about creating more resilient communities, communities who are more tooled up and ready to go and know each other better. It's about reducing, obviously, a person's ecological footprint. It's about strengthening social connections. And it's about assisting in sort of emergency preparedness, all of which feels like it's a really good idea. And it's community owned. And sometimes the community will buy something that's necessary and put it in there too. All about the commons, about the community, about democratic organisation. It's a small thing, but the story's a really good one. It tells us something about what the future could start to look like. We talked about the individualist visionary story. It's an interesting one because it's about somebody imposing a vision. Boyan Slat says, my vision is I'm going to clean up the garbage patch and this is how I'm going to do it. But he is very clearly saying, this is my vision. It's kind of rule-breaking. It's stirring up a new ideology. It's charismatic leadership. This is when Jacinda Ardern, do you remember she decided to trash the idea of GDP as a measure of success for New Zealand? And she decided to replace it with this sort of multi-dimensional living standards framework. She's leading something. She's establishing a different ideology about how they measure success of that country. This space is a little bit about power. It's a little bit about mastery. And the difficult side of this, the dark side, is the sense of dictatorship, the sense that one person is identifying what should be happening. One person has a vision, and that person kind of can head towards dictatorship if you're not too careful. We can get rights removal if we're not too careful in this space. And of course, we always want to dethrone these people. It's very funny to have a laugh at Elon Musk now, right? It's very funny. It's one of the funniest things, I think. So lack of longevity is an issue here. there are these people around there. There are these visionary people. The New Green Radicals is an organisation of people who are simply trying to do that too. They have a particular vision. These are entrepreneurs, business leaders, campaigners who are using quite kind of powerful communications to reframe a particular business, a particular industry, a particular idea. They're kind of trying to spearhead a transition towards a more sort of net zero economy. It is about sort of going very fast, being very opinionated, having a very clear point of view, and not worrying too much about what anybody else says. And that's needed. We need people who can tell that sort of story. Down in this progress through reason space, this is the space, as I said, about somehow taking what we know already and just making a tweak to it and making it better. So the regenerative economy is potentially in this space. The idea, Kate Raworth's idea of generosity is potentially in this space. This is stories of progress and stories of civilization. Paul Polman's Unilever sits within this space, working against their sustainable living plan. And Patagonia, who recently had an advert that just read, "Don't buy this jacket." They're in this space. They're saying, just think hard about when you need to buy this jacket. We're not going away, we're not changing the model, but think hard about when you need this. So improved surveys, enhanced protection around animal species are in this place too. We can tell positive stories of progress through reason in this space. And the interesting example here, I think, is this one. I've seen the future, and it's Norwich, which I just love. I was brought up in Norwich, so I really love it. I've seen the future, it's Norwich. What a brilliant headline. What a fantastic story. Whoever thought of that? This is a really good thought to take forward. It's an engaging idea, right? These are passive houses. They're energy saving. That's not only about an energy saving set of houses, it's also a social housing initiative. So we're looking at social inequality at the same time as we're looking at energy saving houses. So it's a reasoned progress story, and there are plenty of those around. And then finally, we have the kind of radical reframing story. And the radical reframing story is move fast and break things. That's the really big thought, is how can we act in defiance of an existing order? How can we shake people up? How can we reframe? How can we take an existing idea and turn it on its head and make people see something differently? And this is a really interesting one because it could absolutely be Extinction Rebellion, right? It could be in that space, happily, with peaceful protest. It could also be very clearly about something that just changes our mind about stuff. And just changing our minds is what we all kind of need to do. Have you seen this, The Game Changers? I love this as an example. This is a Netflix movie that gets elite athletes and puts them on a vegan diet. Started about 18 months ago, and what you see are these superhuman people apparently becoming even more superhuman, fueled by plants, eating just a plant-based diet. What I love about it is in the space of 18 months, if I'd said to you 18 months ago, close your eyes and imagine a vegan, we all have an archetype of what somebody who eats a vegan diet looks like, right? We all go, oh, maybe a bit too pale, maybe a bit too skinny, but yes, I can see that vegan. Now, 18 months down the line, if you've watched Game Changers, you shut your eyes, imagine a vegan, and you're seeing a superhuman person who has proved to themselves that a vegan diet is something positive, something fulfilling. It's a tiny thing, but what it's saying is food is very gendered, right? In order to be a big, strong man, you need to eat red meat. We're changing that cultural assumption completely. We're saying to be a big, strong man, you need a vegan diet. We're radically reframing the way in which we think about masculinity and the way we think about food, or the way we think about human performance and the way we think about food. So that sits in this quadrant because it's actually a sort of a reconfiguring. And really interestingly for me is it's kind of aligning a positive climate change solution move to vegan diet with kind of human transformation and evolution. It kind of takes us forward. It doesn't put us in a space of denial and, oh, we're not going to have this. It's actually improving things and taking things forward. And that's one example. And there will be hundreds of examples of exactly that sort of transformation that we can take, where solutions to climate change are aligned with human progress and human transformation. And this chap here is the CEO of Greggs. Do you frequent Greggs? I do. This is the CEO of Greggs. He's called Roger Whiteside, and he watched Game Changers, and he tried out a vegan diet, and he really liked it, and that's great. But it was such a compelling story on the Game Changers series that he then went back to his shops and he said, let's make our sausage rolls vegan. And he created the, I have to say, iconic vegan sausage roll. Bit polarizing maybe. But he created that, and then he announced that he'd gone vegan completely, and that's what he was going to do. So he not only did it himself, but he kind of put it through his business. He stood for it. There's a piece of meaningful change. I know it's a bit of mass culture and it's Greggs, but it is meaningful change. It is somebody taking a stand and saying, we can do this Greggs thing, and we can do it in a vegan way, and that's okay. And it's coming from just a story that somebody decided to seed through a Netflix movie, and now we're seeing change and we're seeing possibility coming from that. It's a positive idea. He's changed his life anyway. So none of these stories, or these story modes that we're talking about, deny climate change. None of them are saying, it's not happening, we're just going to go la, 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 and say lovely things. It's not that. Because these stories only exist because there is that challenge. They only exist because there is that difficulty. But we can use them as kind of focal points to build our own stories. Telling stories about a positive response to the issues that we see, that we face every day, is really key to motivating people. So the two frameworks that we've talked about, they give you some guidelines. They give you some guidelines on what sorts of transitions we need to make, what sorts of stories we need to tell in order to respond, in order to inspire, in order to motivate and galvanize people to be more involved, to be more connected, and stories that don't debilitate with fear, because that's the biggest problem in all of this, is that we feel helpless. And those who have created the story that made us feel helpless perhaps will benefit in some way from doing that somewhere down the line. So let's not feel helpless. Let's tell stories which galvanize each other, because if we do, we'll be stronger ourselves as well. So I kind of ask you this question with some urgency, really. It's kind of, what are the stories that you tell when you talk about climate change? Personally, when you go home and you talk to your children, or you talk to your brothers and sisters, or you talk to your grandchildren, when you're in your organization, you're at work, or when you're in your community groups, what story do you choose to tell in that moment? What do you need to write, or what do you need to say in order to be part of a collection of people who can paint a more positive view of the future? And you know, I kind of firmly believe that stories can change the world. And I wonder if they can be part of kind of saving us too. So that's all I wanted to say, other than to acknowledge all of the folks who are working on this idea with us, some of whom I work with in my company, some of whom are academics, some of whom are all around the world. And we are trying to develop this thinking, trying to move it on, trying to write some fictions, trying to create some art to help us focus more on that future beyond some of those stories that we're getting told today, because that's really, really important. That's all I have to say.